Thank you. Gracias a Percy y Catherine por esta introducción, también a Santiago, a Christine Sample para parte de también para oficiar este evento. Voy a hablar en inglés. Santiago me dice que hay traducción si necesita, porque hay muchos que hablan inglés, entonces no será tan malo. Y también lo que tengo aquí frente está en español.
Perdón, entonces una nota logística. Hay audífonos para quienes requieran traducción, quienes necesiten audífonos, por favor, si lo piden, se los alcanzarán directamente. ¿Sí? Bien.
These have been really rich days of discussion, and while my presentation is focusing on what we can do to protect and promote and defend democracy from the international point of view, the collective defense and promotion of democracy. So I really want to focus on the international side. And based on some analysis that I've done of the past international responses to democratic crises. And I want to start though with some thoughts that I just added this morning, and so they're not actually up here on the screen. Coming in from the past 2 days. And one is, I start here with the challenge. The first challenge, I think we have to identify what it is that we're trying to address when we're thinking about should the international community changing its approach. We've been hearing about the second generation of the Carta that President Malo was presenting, and that's because he wants to respond to the current demand, particularly this focus was on social inclusion, which I agree is absolutely fundamental. So when we think about this, when we think about the third wave of democracy, we know that there's been tremendous progress, although I would say I wouldn't go as far as State Secretary went yesterday, when he said, for example, there is no election fraud in the hemisphere anymore. We passed that. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was my reaction. Nicaragua, Nicaragua is a case that I'm particularly focusing on now, and that did have fraud in 2008 as a concern in the municipal election. And the concern is will it reappear this year in the presidential election? So unfortunately, we haven't even completely overcome the old sources of democratic challenge. But generally, I think they've changed. There continues to be democratic crisis and important threats, but they're very complex. But these threaten democratic stability. And I think that the first one, and the one that President Humala and that Peru is really focusing on, and can you hear me okay over there? So I'm speaking loud enough. I can speak. Is this better or is this worse? That's better? Okay. The first one is that excluded people, excluded populations, are using their political rights to demand social inclusion now. And the most extreme and important example of that is Bolivia, I think, where they use their political rights to actually finally take political power in the sense of electing an indigenous government. But as people are using their political rights, especially for protest, for social protest, we see repercussions for government. And in fact, in the last, over a 15-year period, we saw 13 leaders removed from office prematurely, many of those as a result of social protest, in coalition with sometimes factions of the military, sometimes in coalition with the Congress, sometimes in coalition with the court. Okay, but the social protest can begin. Now, a second thing that I think we're seeing is the growing strength of other powers of government, other branches of government. Latin America is no longer the presidential system, the presidencialismo that we've seen in the past, and particularly legislatures are exerting their strength, and in some cases, courts, Supreme Courts are as well. We also need to take into account the strong decentralization and the role of governors and mayors. But because of this a diffusion of power, which is very favorable, we also see conflict resulting. And that, I think, is the second source that we need to be looking at today, which is the second source of crisis, of democratic crisis that can destabilize government. Now, I do believe that the sorts of crude interventions of the past are being overcome. The massive fraud, classic gold-faced political prisoners, massive political prisoners, legal discrimination. We have overcome those for the most part. But they have passed to more sophisticated manipulation or threats that we should continue to be aware of as we're working on improving the quality of democracy. Some of these have been mentioned in the past couple of days, and I'll just review them quickly. Instead of, for the most part, fraudulent elections, we are concerned now, as Rafa said yesterday, unfair elections, elecciones injustas. So we're concerned about the fairness of elections. We're seeing, in some cases, coup coalitions, perhaps with civil society or with the courts, as I mentioned, rather than the classic traditional military gold-face. We're seeing selective restrictions on the freedom of expression. And we're seeing not legal, but de facto discrimination, racial and gender discrimination that has not been eliminated. So, the question is, what do we do in the face of this from the point of view of the international community? The Democratic Charter speaks of these things and it attempts to respond, but lacks the criteria, lacks the preventative capacity, and, as we know, often the OAS lacks the political will. But I think we've got to ask ourselves, and I really hope we can have some discussions here today, what are the normative bases for collective responsibility to reinforce the obligation that the state has signed on to, particularly the Democratic Charter? What are the normative bases for collective responsibility to enforce these obligations? This, I think, is the key that we have to consider. What is the threshold of violation? At what point does the international community respond? And with what instruments? How do we respond to these complex, sophisticated challenges that are no longer the crude manipulations, the crude interventions of military or of states that are obvious to respond to, but much more nuanced? This, I think, is our challenge. Okay. Now, so I have done, as I said, an analysis about the kinds of international responses that we've done, and the analysis is based on the behavior and identity of specific national actors that can produce these crises and threats. Of course, there are structural factors, there are international factors that I'm not including in the analysis. I could have taken an analysis based on the functional threats, but I'm looking at the actors as the sources of crisis because I think that is important to look at in terms of the response. The international community responds differently to when different actors are the source of the crisis. So I want to make that caveat to begin with.